Vanessa Williams walked into the courtroom with a calm confidence that belied the frustration she was feeling. It wasn't the first time she'd had to fight for something, but today felt different. The case seemed trivial, a fine for a minor parking violation, but it was one more example of a system that often felt designed to keep people like her in check. Vanessa was a professional, a leader in the National Fair Pay Initiative, and someone who had spent years advocating for systemic change in an often hostile environment. She couldn't shake the feeling that today, of all days, her small misstep would be met with resistance. The courtroom was typical, lined with rows of seats that never seemed to fill. Vanessa took her place before Judge Robert Hayes, a man who, despite his reputation for strict rulings, had a history of treating cases like hers with harshness. Vanessa had heard enough stories about his demeanor in the court, how his decisions were often swift and unforgiving. Judge Hayes looked up from the bench as Vanessa stood before him. She had prepared for the usual proceedings, a quick review of the violation, a stern warning, perhaps a fine, and that would be the end of it. She'd done nothing wrong in her mind. The parking ticket was a misunderstanding, a small mistake on the city's part. Yet, as she made her case, she could see the judge's disinterest from the start. His eyes were focused more on the papers before him than on her words. "Ms. Williams," the judge interrupted, his voice steady but cold, "it seems you're trying to present a case where none exists. Your vehicle was parked in an unauthorized area, and the fine is quite clear. I don't see how further discussion is necessary." Vanessa clenched her fists, keeping her composure. She had worked hard to get where she was today, to be respected in her field, to demand that people listen to her when she spoke about equality. And yet here she was, being dismissed so easily. She understood the nuances of the legal system, how small decisions from those in power could ripple through the lives of ordinary people, but it still stung to feel her voice silenced by someone like Judge Hayes. "Your Honor," she began, her voice firm but calm, "I'm simply asking for fairness. This fine was issued under circumstances that don't match the reality of the situation. I believe it's a mistake, and I'm asking for you to reconsider it." Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow but didn't budge. He glanced at the clock and sighed before leaning forward, his gaze cold and unwavering. "I'm afraid I don't share your interpretation of the facts. You will pay the fine in full." The gavel came down with an authoritative thud. Vanessa's heart sank. There would be no leniency, no second chances. Her request for fairness had been dismissed without a second thought. As she left the courtroom, the sting of the ruling lingered. This was more than just a parking ticket. It felt like one more reminder that the systems in place were not designed for people like her. Vanessa stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of the judge's ruling settling on her shoulders. As she walked down the steps, the cool air hit her face, but it did little to quell the frustration building inside. This was just another reminder of the battle she had been fighting her entire life, against systems that didn't always see her for who she was or acknowledge the work she had done. She had been in the fight for justice for years, but today, it felt different. The fine wasn't about money. It was about being heard. It was about how society so often silences those who don't fit the traditional mold. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, Vanessa had learned early on that life didn't hand out opportunities. Her parents had worked long hours just to make ends meet, and they had instilled in her a sense of grit and determination. They taught her that hard work would always be necessary, but it wouldn't always be enough. The world, especially for Black women, often required more than just diligence. It required visibility, recognition, and most of all, fairness. It was this realization that pushed Vanessa to excel in her studies and later pursue a law degree. She graduated near the top of her class, despite facing challenges that others didn't seem to notice. Throughout her journey, she had been met with skepticism and doubt from others. But she pushed through, learning to use her voice in spaces where it was often drowned out by others. Her mission to address the gender and racial wage gap became her primary focus, and she joined the Federal Fair Pay Initiative, a program designed to advocate for equal pay and improve workplace equity. Vanessa knew that the statistics told a painful story. Women of color were paid far less than their white male counterparts, with few protections in place to ensure fair compensation. Her efforts were not just about policy. They were about changing mindsets. She had built a platform for herself, becoming a respected voice on Capitol Hill and in boardrooms across the country. But none of it had been easy. Every victory felt like an uphill climb, and every setback, no matter how small, was a reminder of how fragile progress could be. As she drove to her office that afternoon, Vanessa reflected on the fine. It wasn't just about this one court case, but about everything she had fought against. The everyday injustices that often went unnoticed. Judge Hayes' ruling seemed insignificant compared to the work she was doing, but it was a reminder of the larger forces at play. She couldn't let this setback deter her. She had a responsibility to continue fighting, not just for herself, but for the thousands of women and families who faced the same systemic barriers. She would keep going. For them. For all of them. But as she sat at her desk later that day, her phone buzzed with news. A local journalist had already picked up the story. It seemed like the fine was about to become much more than a personal inconvenience. It was about to make waves. The news hit fast. Vanessa hadn't expected her court appearance to garner much attention, but within hours, her name was being shared across social media platforms. Local news stations were picking up the story, and journalists had started reaching out for interviews. The headline was simple but loaded: "Local woman fined by judge, unaware of her role in federal pay equity movement." At first, Vanessa was surprised by the speed at which the story spread. She had anticipated some minor coverage, perhaps a quick mention in passing. But not this. She wasn't sure how to feel. On one hand, the attention felt invasive, like her personal frustration was now a spectacle for everyone to see. But on the other hand, it gave her a chance to shine a light on something much bigger than herself. This wasn't about the fine anymore. It was about fairness, about the systemic challenges people like her faced every day, often without any acknowledgement. Her phone rang again, and she saw Marcus Jenkins' name flashing on the screen. He was a close colleague and a fellow advocate for pay equity. She had been working with him for years on the federal initiative, and his voice was always one of reason and support. "Vanessa," Marcus said, his voice a mixture of concern and excitement. "I just saw the news. I know this fine probably feels like a slap in the face, but you might want to think about how this could change the conversation. People are listening to you now. This could be your chance to push the issues you care about into the spotlight." Vanessa leaned back in her chair, staring at the phone. She'd always believed that the work she was doing with the Fair Pay Initiative was important, but she hadn't anticipated how something as seemingly trivial as a court fine would become a catalyst for a larger conversation about fairness, racial bias, and the need for systemic change. It was a stark reminder that injustice wasn't always obvious. Sometimes it was embedded in everyday encounters that most people wouldn't even notice. "I'm not sure I want to make a spectacle out of this," Vanessa replied, her voice steady but filled with the weight of the situation. "But you're right. This is about more than just me. It's about the bigger picture. It's about how small decisions can contribute to larger patterns of inequality." Marcus agreed, and they both began brainstorming ways to turn the attention toward the issues that mattered most to Vanessa: gender and racial pay gaps. They discussed how to use the media attention to raise awareness about the systemic barriers faced by marginalized communities in the workplace, particularly women of color. As Vanessa hung up the phone, she couldn't shake the feeling that her fight was no longer just one she was waging on her own. It was a collective battle, one that would require all her courage, determination, and a shift in perspective. The fine had done something unexpected. It had given her a platform, a chance to shine a light on something that had been hidden in plain sight for too long. And now, with the world watching, she was ready to take her fight to the next level. Within 24 hours, the courtroom incident had taken on a life of its own. Vanessa's name was everywhere. Headlines blasted across local newspapers, and national outlets picked up the story as well. News anchors began discussing her case during prime time, with commentary ranging from heated debates about judicial fairness to reflections on racial and gender disparities in the workplace. On social media, hashtags like #FairPay and #JusticeForVanessa gained traction. People from all walks of life, including activists, celebrities, and ordinary citizens, voiced their opinions, sharing their own experiences with legal systems they felt were often biased and unyielding. Vanessa's story, once just a minor inconvenience, had turned into a symbol of a much larger issue. Suddenly, the courtroom fine wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever felt dismissed, misunderstood, or unfairly treated. Some were quick to call the judge's decision into question, with many arguing that the ruling was out of proportion given her status as a leader in the National Fair Pay Initiative. The media latched onto this angle, portraying the fine as an ironic twist of fate. Someone who spent her life advocating for fairness was penalized in a way that many saw as unjust. Vanessa watched it all unfold from her office, her thoughts racing. She'd never intended for her personal situation to take center stage. She had always kept her professional and personal lives separate, focusing on her mission to bring change at the federal level. But now, with the attention directed at her, she was faced with an unexpected challenge: how to turn this moment into an opportunity for greater impact. Her phone rang again, and this time it was from a prominent journalist who had been covering the story all morning. "Vanessa, people are asking about your next steps. Are you going to fight the fine? Are you planning to take legal action against the judge?" Vanessa paused, considering the question. She had already made it clear in the media that she felt the fine was unjust, but fighting it in court might be a longer, more drawn-out process. What she needed was to make the conversation shift towards something more important: the systemic inequities in pay that she had been fighting for years. She didn't want to get stuck in a personal battle. She wanted to use this moment to refocus the national discussion on fair pay, on how small actions can lead to larger, more systemic problems. "I'm not concerned about the fine itself," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But I do believe we need to address why something as small as this is even possible, why so many people, particularly women of color, continue to face unfairness in ways both large and small. We need to change that conversation. This is just one example of how much further we have to go." The journalist, impressed by her focus, agreed to take the story in a new direction. Vanessa felt a sense of resolve. She had the attention of the public now, and she wasn't about to waste it. It was time to bring the real issues to the forefront. Judge Robert Hayes sat in his office, a stack of case files in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. The images and headlines about Vanessa Williams kept flashing in his mind, gnawing at him. He had never imagined that a routine court appearance could spiral into something this explosive, and he had certainly never expected to be part of a story that questioned the very fairness of the legal system he had spent his life upholding. For a moment, he considered what he had done in the courtroom that day. The fine, his swift dismissal of Vanessa's argument. It all seemed so simple, so straightforward. But now, seeing the outcry, hearing the public's outrage, a troubling thought began to surface. Had he missed something? Was his decision influenced by something deeper than the facts of the case? The more he thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about the way he had handled Vanessa's case. He had grown up in a small, predominantly white town, where strict rules were always enforced without question. He had learned early on that law and order meant making decisions without emotion, without the influence of personal biases. But now, confronted with Vanessa's story and her public fight for justice, he was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that he might have acted out of subconscious bias. He had never considered the full implications of his actions, nor had he realized the weight that his position of authority carried when it came to people like Vanessa, people who had spent years fighting for the very fairness he had taken for granted. Judge Hayes found himself pacing the floor, wrestling with his thoughts. The public backlash was mounting, but it wasn't just the media attention that troubled him. It was the growing realization that his actions, however small, had been a reflection of a larger system, one that he was a part of, but had never questioned. The fine had become more than a simple legal matter. It had become a symbol of deeper injustices. Vanessa wasn't just a woman fighting against a minor fine. She was a voice for a movement that was challenging everything he had long taken as fact. There was no denying it anymore. He needed to do something about it. After a long, sleepless night, Judge Hayes made a decision. He would reach out to Vanessa. He had no idea how she would respond, but the first step was clear. He needed to understand her story, to understand the bigger picture. The fine wasn't about money. It was about something deeper, something much harder to face. He picked up the phone and dialed Vanessa's number, knowing that this call would change everything. Vanessa's phone buzzed just as she was preparing for another round of interviews. It was an unrecognized number, but there was something about the ring that made her hesitate. She hadn't expected to hear from anyone involved in her case, especially not Judge Hayes. Curiosity tugged at her, and she picked up the phone, her finger hovering over the screen. "Hello, Vanessa Williams." The voice on the other end was calm but cautious. It was Judge Hayes. Vanessa's first instinct was to hang up. Why would he be calling her now, after everything that had transpired? After dismissing her plea in court with such ease, why would he want to speak to her at all? But something in his voice told her this wasn't about to be another one of the public soundbites she'd been getting used to. She took a breath and decided to listen. "Yes, this is Vanessa," she said, keeping her tone even. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" I've been reflecting on our interaction in court," Judge Hayes began, "and I feel that I may have acted without fully understanding who you are or what you stand for. I wanted to reach out to you directly to understand your perspective and to apologize if my decision was unfair." Vanessa paused. She hadn't expected this. Apologies in her world were rare, and especially rare coming from someone in a position of power. She took a moment to absorb his words. Judge Hayes had built a career on making tough, sometimes unpopular decisions. For him to admit that he might have made a mistake was unexpected. It gave her pause. "I appreciate you reaching out, Judge Hayes," she said carefully, her voice still calm but carrying the weight of everything that had led to this point. "But I'll be honest, it's going to take more than a phone call for me to feel like you understand the gravity of what happened." "I understand," he said, his voice soft but genuine. "I didn't take the time to consider the broader context, and I think that was my failure. I've been reading about your work, your efforts toward pay equity and racial justice, and I'm beginning to see how my actions, however small they seemed, are part of a larger pattern of injustice. I want to learn more about your mission. I want to understand how I, as a judge, might help in addressing these issues." Vanessa felt the weight of his words. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about something much deeper. She had spent years fighting against systems that had long been resistant to change. She had faced skepticism, doubt, and even outright hostility from those who didn't believe in the kind of change she was advocating for. But this felt different. She wasn't being asked to explain herself, to justify her cause. Instead, she was being heard. "You're asking the right questions, Judge," she said, her voice steady now. "And if you're serious about understanding the systemic issues I'm fighting, it's going to take more than just reading about it. It's about taking action, real action, changing how the systems work. That starts with acknowledging that the systems are broken." There was a brief pause on the line before he spoke again, his voice firmer now. "I want to be a part of that change, Vanessa. I'm committed to listening and learning." For the first time since the court case, Vanessa felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this unexpected phone call would be the start of something bigger. Over the next few weeks, Vanessa and Judge Hayes met several times, each conversation growing deeper and more meaningful. Initially, Vanessa had been skeptical. She had heard the empty promises of those in power before, people who claimed to understand, only to retreat when the conversation became uncomfortable. But Judge Hayes wasn't like the others. His curiosity was genuine. He asked questions that showed he was truly trying to understand the struggles faced by women of color, especially in the workplace. Their first meeting had been a turning point. Vanessa had agreed to sit down with him at a local cafe, a neutral ground where neither the courtroom nor her office loomed overhead. She wasn't sure what to expect, but when she walked in, she found Judge Hayes already seated, a stack of papers on the table before him. It was clear he had been studying, not just the case, but the broader issues of racial and gender inequality she had been advocating for. "I spent the last few days reading about the gender and racial wage gaps, Vanessa," Judge Hayes began, his voice more thoughtful than it had been in court. "I had no idea how entrenched these issues were, how many people are fighting for what seems like basic fairness. I want to be part of that fight. I want to understand how the legal system can be a tool for change, not just enforcement." Vanessa was struck by his sincerity. It was rare for someone in his position to acknowledge the depth of the problem without resorting to defensiveness or dismissive rhetoric. She felt herself starting to open up, her words flowing more freely as she spoke about the toll that years of inequality had taken on her and countless others. She shared her experiences with the Fair Pay Initiative and how, despite the initiative's success, there had been constant resistance from powerful institutions. She talked about the women she'd met throughout her career, many of whom had been passed over for promotions, underpaid or overlooked entirely simply because of their race or gender. Every day, these women fought battles that often went unnoticed. Vanessa had made it her life's mission to bring those stories to the forefront, to demand change not just in policy, but in the very culture of workplaces and the legal system that upheld them. As the conversation deepened, Judge Hayes became more reflective, his gaze thoughtful. "I can see now that the issues you're working on are much more than theoretical," he said quietly. "They're real, and they affect real people. I had no idea how deep the roots of inequality run, but now that I do, I'm committed to using my position to make real change." Vanessa nodded, feeling a mixture of hope and cautious optimism. She had always believed in the power of education and awareness to shift perspectives, but to see someone in power actively wanting to change was rare. Perhaps together, they could start making those changes, even if it meant challenging the very systems that had long been in place. For the first time since the fine, Vanessa felt like she wasn't alone in this fight. Months passed, and Vanessa's partnership with Judge Hayes began to take shape in ways that neither of them had initially expected. Their collaboration wasn't just about addressing her parking fine. It had evolved into something far greater. What had begun as an isolated incident had sparked a larger movement, one that brought attention to issues of racial and gender inequality in the judicial system, in the workplace, and beyond. Judge Hayes, once a figure of authority whose rulings were rarely questioned, began to use his position to advocate for policies that would address pay inequity. He introduced a series of initiatives aimed at educating fellow judges and law enforcement officers about the impacts of systemic bias. He also worked with Vanessa to help draft proposals for legislation that would require employers to implement transparent pay practices and enforce strict penalties for those who failed to comply with fair pay standards. The media attention, which had initially felt overwhelming to Vanessa, became an invaluable tool in raising awareness. With Hayes' support, she began to appear on national talk shows, where she spoke not only about her personal journey but also about the broader issues of inequality that needed urgent attention. Her voice, amplified by the unexpected platform, reached millions, and people began to take notice. The growing movement sparked discussions in boardrooms, classrooms, and even in families, as the conversation about equal pay and racial justice found its way into the homes of ordinary citizens. Vanessa's relationship with Judge Hayes remained a central part of the movement's story. They held joint press conferences, spoke at rallies, and appeared together at policy forums. Their unexpected alliance became a symbol of what could happen when people from different walks of life, people who once might have been at odds, came together with a shared commitment to change. It was a testament to the power of dialogue, understanding, and empathy, even in the most unlikely of partnerships. But the real impact of their work could be seen in the stories of the people who had been waiting for change for decades. Women of color who had struggled for years in low-paying jobs, who had faced discrimination in the workplace, began to see more opportunities for advancement. Employers who had previously ignored pay disparity complaints started to take them more seriously, knowing that the consequences would be significant. One day, as Vanessa stood before a group of legislators at a press briefing, she found herself reflecting on the journey. She had started as just a woman fighting against an unjust parking fine, but now she was at the forefront of a movement that was reshaping the very fabric of American society. The fine, once a symbol of frustration, had become the catalyst for real, lasting change. I've learned that every injustice, no matter how small it may seem, is a part of something much bigger, Vanessa said, her voice steady and resolute. And together, we can turn that injustice into a movement that changes lives, challenges systems, and builds a future of fairness for all. As the crowd applauded, Vanessa knew this was only the beginning. The fight was far from over, but with every step they took, they were creating a future that would no longer tolerate inequality in any form. The ripple that had started with one small fine had now grown into a tidal wave of change.